need right here for me, sir.
You understand this is being taped right now, right? Oh, so that's what that big square of light is. This is where my friend Sean and I put Edward's body to dispose of it. We dragged the body up along there, just right on top of the ridge there. I wind up having to get on hand and knee, grabbing the one steel rail in order to keep myself from potentially falling over the side, because I have to kick Edward's body over, just to get to roll down over the drop-off. Edward had a habit of treating people rather subpar. We did what we felt was necessary.
Harford County 911.
I came home and my roommates weren't home and it looks like there was a fight. My bookshelf is busted, my Xbox controller's ripped out, and my boyfriend's shoes are still under the bed, but he's gone. I don't know what happened.
Okay, you don't know exactly what happened there?
No, his phone's off, and I'm really worried.
Blair mentioned there was a mess in the apartment, so I spend my time thinking, like, what the heck's going on?
Okay.
I want a day of peace, and it turns into f***ing anarchy here.
How do you know Blair? How do you know Eddie?
Me and Blair have a friendship. Eddie is her new boyfriend. I've known Eddie for a little while, but I don't know him that much. I'm not an easy guy to get to know. I only have a few friends. I'm kind of brash. I'm kind of out there. I tend to keep to myself because I don't really want many friends. It's kind of how I am.
I'm gonna let you know what we found at the scene. They came across some blood, and then Eddie's missing. One of the neighbors remembers seeing you and Alex there, carrying something large out to the car.
That wasn't anything like that. This is gonna sound like complete crap, but he's got my tools.
What I need you to tell me is why.
Why what?
Why everything happened tonight.
Look, I don't know what you're talking about, okay?
He's going to start with just flat-out denial, which isn't believable. Just because someone's psychopathic does not mean they're intelligent about how to lie well.
But he adds different things that he hopes will make him seem vulnerable and authentic, such as, I know this doesn't sound right, but it's actually the truth. But there's blood everywhere. So it's a careless, impulsive murder with no forethought and no thinking about what would happen.
So, what's your relationship with each one of them?
Edward Hayden is my boyfriend, and Sean Turcott is a friend who lives with me, who is my ex-boyfriend. It's complicated.
Well, tell me about today.
I unlock the door like usual. I step in. I notice that Sean's still not home yet. And I'm like, where's Eddie? To the left side of the bed, it's a really big stain. And my Xbox controller wires sticking out. And it kind of made me think, could Sean really do something to Eddie? He can be spontaneously violent, but I don't see him as someone who could commit murder. But I don't know anything anymore. That one time he choked me was terrifying.
When you were looking at him, how did he look?
Like he wanted to kill me.
Being choked is a sign of extreme danger. It was happening after they broke up. He feels she doesn't have any right to break up the relationship, and he chokes her because he feels that she's betraying him. He feels entitled because he owns her.
So Sean got kicked out of his ex-girlfriend's house, and I decided to let him move in. And he's been very faithful with the rent. Mostly living situations between the three of us are quite tame.
The word mostly, it's a very telling term, which means there's a story there. Because it's mostly tame, which means it's not always tame. Here are some excerpts from her diary. Blair writes, "Sean makes me so mad since he moved in. He can be such a jerk sometimes. He needs to change his damn attitude, stop snapping at me for stuff he did." To the police, she's minimizing how tempestuous the relationship was in the household. He's snapping at her, and we know that he choked her. This blaming other people or externalizing responsibility is one of the signs that we see in psychopathy.
How's Sean holding up?
I don't know. I haven't spoken to Sean. Do you have any medical issues that would prevent you from remembering certain things like this that we're talking about today?
I have ADHD and Asperger's.
Something happened to Eddie tonight, and I think you and Sean and Blair know a lot more than what you're telling us.
Sean's tried staying out of their crap. Sean's ulcer was partially because of stress pertaining to Eddie.
I don't doubt that one bit.
Sean and I, over the years, have done our damnedest to do the right thing by other people and keep getting screwed over. When Sean and I were in middle school and high school together, no one gave a damn enough to do anything. I don't know if you believe in past life regression. He and I have gone way back. When I'm going on this trip, he and I actually tread during those events over 2,000 years. That's how strong our friendship is. And it's been tested in the blood of wolves.
Alex has had very clear characteristics of autism spectrum disorder. You can see it in his language. He's very pedantic, he's very exact. Alex has a limited understanding of friendships and empathy, and he thinks Sean is his best friend for thousands of years. And the way that these two come together is a recipe for disaster. Sean's psychopathic traits are going to make him very quick to exploit the weaknesses in other people and figure out how he can use them to his own advantage.
Can you just tell me yes or no? Do you know where Eddie's at right now?
That was the only way to get the abuse to end.
Okay, I get that.
He is not among the living. Sean and I were doing this because we felt it was what had to be done. I want what's best for Sean. His own family disowned him at age 5. His PTSD is worse than mine. Anytime he tries to make one step forward, someone has to slap him right back down. Eddie was actually, in a way, killing Sean. And I don't want him to die.
His identity gets fused with Sean Turcotte. Psychologically and emotionally, it sounds like he accepted the idea that seeing Eddie alive was killing Sean, so helping them get rid of Eddie would help Sean live.
He seems so completely under the spell of Turcotte, and he has internalized Turcotte's self-pity, blame the world narrative, which is a very psychopathic and batterer narrative. It really feels like a cult leader and a cult follower type of relationship. And so there's a element of brainwashing, loyalty, devotion, and willingness to commit crime for him.
The plan originally was that Eddie would be asleep. It turned out he wasn't. He was up gaming. So we tried to change things on the fly. I've got the knife in my right hand.
So that's how it
Right,
ended up in there.
plunged into the side of his neck.
And then Sean is doing what?
He's swinging with the mallet.
He's really convinced that Sean is a victim. The evidence that he brings up that convinces him is so childlike and false and weak and has no solid foundation. But to him, it's really true. And which tells us a little bit about the childlikeness of his mind, for example. He's also really convinced that if you suffer, you have to do something about it. And that you do whatever you need to do in order to keep your friend alive. And so I think he is demonstrating for us the quality of the bond, how tightly bonded he is, and how loyal he is. It's you know, it has a little bit the flavor of Stockholm Syndrome or brainwashing.
I've already talked to Blair,
I know.
and I've already talked to Alex.
I'm going to tell you, and you, sir, for the record, I did not kill Eddie.
Well, what happened to Eddie then?
I came back home, and he's been really weird lately, okay? He killed himself. And if you knew Blair, you'd know that you'd never have any money. That woman will drain you dry. His paychecks not only go to his son for child support, but for her selfish needs. I tried getting this man to leave because I saw how much pain he was in. The man was hurt.
He is now framing things differently. He doesn't have aggression towards Eddie. I didn't hate him. I actually liked him. He's my friend. I felt sorry for him. Psychopathic people, they will try and shift blame to someone else. So he's shifting it to his ex. And he's lying, but he's really trying now to manipulate the circumstances so that he can come out and look good.
I came back. There was a laceration in his neck. He was dead on the floor when I saw that. And me and Alex panicked. We freaked.
What do you do next?
As up as it sounds, we wrapped him up. We dumped him. I should have just called you guys and said, look, this guy killed himself. But I didn't. I panicked.
A little over a week before Eddie was murdered, Sean sent a message to a friend on social media. She loves hurting me, and so does Eddie. I would love to take him out in the woods and hunt him like the pig he is. And then he writes, I simply want to kidnap him and kill him at Rock State Park. Take him out to Allegheny Forest and dump his cold dead corpse in the roaring waters so the sharks can eat him. It isn't just a vague thought of killing him. He's actually now articulating a plan for committing murder. He's describing the location of where the body is in fact found. So it's not smart, but he's not even ashamed of his feelings. These are signs that we see in psychopathy.
Mind you, I'm not in the right state of mind because of living with these two. Can you only imagine what would happen if she found him like that? She would blame me in a heartbeat.
Alex and you were tight. Why would
Yes.
he say that you guys killed him?
It's because he has a deep-seated rage thing.
So Alex killed him for you?
Alex didn't kill him. This dude killed himself. Don't ask me how. He had a knife in his neck. This guy had some serious problems. He kept complaining about money. Now, I remember being in that position, but I'm not a suicidal or homicidal person at all. Eddie had a death wish.
When Sean Turcotte's making these comments, we're really learning more about him, because we know that he attributes blame to other people. He attributes emotional states to other people. And so it's possible that he himself experiences a death wish. But he'll say anything right now to keep diverting the police officer's attention to somebody else in order to still appear like he's the victim in the story right now.
Look, I'm not a bright person. I'm not very smart. I always have problems, but I'm not capable of doing something like this. And I'm not gonna lie, I didn't like Eddie. I chuckled a little. But I would have never hurt that man. We got into a scuffle for a little bit, but I wanted bygones to be bygones. I wanted to save my money and leave. I didn't want to live there anymore. I lived on a broken futon. And I don't know how to deal with death very well, I really don't. And I'm sorry for sounding really uptight and angry, but I don't know how else to explain this.
I believe Alex's story. I believe the neighbor's story. When I get the body out of the water and I find dagger marks elsewhere, then that's going to make the story even more believable.
You know what? I'm going to tell you the truth. He did it. Alex killed him.
Did he kill him for you?
He did. He's my best friend and would do anything in the world for me.
He had recruited a friend who would do anything for him and manipulated him to help him get it done, and then is willing to throw him under the bus, which lets you see the lack of empathy, the lack of a genuine bond. There's no regard even for Alex's feelings. He'll ditch his friend right away.
Psychopaths really want to use people as chess pieces in the game of life. That's how they see other people. If they can't get around them, they need to move them out of the way with force.
Alex stabbed him in the neck.
Where?
I think in the back of his neck or something. I really wasn't paying attention. I was too horrified watching the blood. That man helped me every step of the way, and not just with that. I've been stepped on my whole life. If I had a chance to talk to Alex right now, I'd tell him I'm sorry. And if he punched me in the face, I'd take it like a man. He's my best friend. He's the only friend I've ever had.
I'm not buying that emotion that he just had there when he says he's the only friend I've ever had. He has kind of a crack in his voice, but he's really crafty in that he's probably able to hold it under this facade of being a good guy.
I didn't want him to use the damn thing. I said, here, Alex, because I wanted him to crack him on the skull to get him to talk.
What did you want him to talk about?
I wanted him to stop using Blair. Blair doesn't stand up for herself. She's like my mom. She gets constantly railroaded by my dad. But I don't have it in me to hit anybody. Me and my dad used to get into fights and he'd lay me out. He's an ex-army.
I think he's explaining in a very honest way, even if it's immature, why he feels he needs to protect Blair. The way he idealizes and devalues particularly Blair, but also interestingly Eddie, are very much part of how he splits into good and bad. She's horrible and manipulative, so the boyfriend needs to go. Other times, she doesn't stand up for herself, like my mother, and so I need to do it for her. We don't know the full story, and we only know what Sean Turcotte says, but this kind of splitting, meaning idolizing and then devaluing the person based on your emotional turmoil, is almost always because of abuse.
And I've always cared about Blair. I've always loved her. Me and Blair have a friendship.
Right,
We used to have a relationship. We had a daughter in 2010. We were ready to have a kid. We went to an adoption agency and we gave her up for adoption. But the grief drove us apart. That woman has every right to hate my guts. She already sees me as a monster for us getting rid of our daughter. I did what my father couldn't do. I made us do the right thing for our child's future before our own. Did that screw us up? Yeah.
The story that he tells only emphasizes his nobility. He couldn't possibly have been a decent father. He's a violent man who is financially unstable. But the abuse he suffered doesn't justify the terrible way he treats women or the fact that he murdered his girlfriend's boyfriend.
My friend Sean getting severe ulcers from the stress of these environments and the torment he and I went through growing up. It was slowly killing him, having to deal with this. I wish it didn't have to turn out this way for this mess to occur.
Des Moines Police.
Hi, my name is Paula Thompson, and my son actually is on probation, and he's trying to get in the house. And
hey, what's your son's name?
Christopher Thompson, and he's like, I hear you calling the police, Mom, please don't, blah, and he's yelling.
Is he threatening you or anything?
Well, I won't let him in the house because he went and bought some alcohol.
Okay, I can send an officer out to you. If anything changes, give me a call back. Are you still there?
Yes, like he's pounding on my window.
He was mad. He was like knocking on the door, Mom, let me in. You didn't really call the police. Yeah, I did. And then he took off in his car.
Does he stay here with you?
Occasionally. He doesn't really have anywhere to live.
Yes, I'm getting a welfare check.
Yep, and what's her name again, sorry?
It's Paula Thompson.
Okay, what's the situation? What's going on?
Well, she has not responded for several days, and she hasn't checked in with her boss, so I called her son, and he has now said that he, harmed her, and she's dead.
Des Moines police were called after a co-worker, a 50-year-old Paula Thompson, noticed she hadn't been at work lately.
They found that there was a door ajar, and they entered into the home to check on her, and unfortunately found her deceased inside the home.
For hours, detectives were on a search for her son, 32-year-old Christopher Thompson, and finally found him 3 hours later when he turned himself in to the Polk County Jail.
Let me get some basic information from you, and then we'll get started, okay? You go, Chris or Christopher? Chris. All right. Okay. So what? I guess we can start off. What caused you to go into Polk County and say you have a warrant?
Because my mom's friend called, and I told her that I got into a big argument with my mom. We were both drunk. I blacked out and killed her.
Okay.
And I told her to call the cops.
He doesn't have any emotion in his voice. He says, I killed her the same way that someone might say where they had dinner last night. His specific type of lack of empathy really has more of a juvenile type quality. He almost seems like he has the problem-solving skills of a 3-year-old, but obviously the aggressive skills of an adult, and that can be a bad combination.
When did the fight happen with your mom?
On Friday the 13th. And it was dark. It was dark. So, and when she drinks, she gets really stupid and starts slamming things and yelling at me and telling me I'm not doing a good job at life, that I'm like a big mistake, and just always just negative. And well, the argument got really heated, and she got in my face, I got in hers, and then it escalated. And I don't even know when I hit her in the head with a crowbar, and a few times.
So she was saying this when you had the crowbar in your hand?
Well, before I had the crowbar. And when I didn't say anything, I just went up and bam.
Okay. So you didn't even hesitate. You just grabbed the crowbar, came right down that hole and hit her?
Yeah.
But the first hit, she wasn't able to react at all?
I should have felt blood. Her hair was everywhere.
Many of us are able to regulate our emotions like a dimmer switch. We know when to turn things up, we know when to turn them down, and it's situation by situation. Thompson shows us that he really functions like a light switch. He's either on or he's off. And when he's on, he's volatile. When he's drinking and he's on, he's not only volatile, he's violent.
Okay. Was she facing you when you hit her?
Yeah.
Okay. And what happened when you hit her? Was she able to...
She went down.
Right away?
Right away.
Okay.
She went down. And then I hit her a few more times, and she stopped moving.
He almost sounds surprised when reliving it that it happened that fast. But he also then goes on to say he hit her a few more times. And that's where we see with individuals like Thompson that have these psychopathic tendencies, there's that inability to regulate their emotions and their rage, and it just came stumbling out.
And she was on the floor, and she was just laying there, and I didn't know what to do, so I put her back, dragged her into her room, and closed the door, and I was shaking, and I knew everything was over.
Okay. And as far as you said, the fight escalated, so obviously it started off just verbal.
Yeah.
Correct? Then did it get physical from there, and then you got the crowbar, or how did that kind of go down?
More of she was getting in my face, and I just snapped. Because she wouldn't let me close my door, because I was done. And it was...
You were trying to go into your room to kind of separate or whatever.
And she said it was her house, so doors open. She said that she's basically telling me that my life is just a pathetic piece of and that everything was hers. All of it was hers. Clothes I'm wearing, everything. And I blew up. I just couldn't take it anymore.
Victim blaming is a common characteristic in psychopathic behavior. Mr. Thompson is exhibiting a failure to accept responsibility. He's saying, well, she was negative. She kept telling me I wasn't living life well. And so essentially it's her fault that he acted the way that he did and ultimately killed her.
You can see how he had this narcissistic injury. When someone is very narcissistic, which is almost always what you'll see in psychopaths, they have a very fragile ego. It's inflated, almost like a balloon that's been inflated just about at its capacity. And if anything is going to disrupt that ego, it's going to burst.
And you said earlier, at one point you said you blacked out. Can you kind of...
It was when I attacked.
When you attacked? Mm-hmm. And what exactly were you feeling, or what do you mean by blacked out?
Like I didn't see anything else, but I wanted it to be over. And so I just kept hitting her.
Okay. What was going through your mind whenever that was going on?
Rage. Just anger. I wanted it to be over.
What he's talking about was kind of a white-hot rage, where he was just fully unhinged, not trying to control his behaviors anymore. He seems to remember it pretty well, so I don't think he blacked out. He may be trying to get across the point where he's not planning to do this. He didn't try to do it. He was just reacting. He's trying to take away some of the potential blame.
Okay. When did you realize that she was dead?
There was a blood just leaking out.
Okay. And then did you move her into the room pretty much immediately, or was she in the hallway for a little bit? Like, what was the time frame on that?
No, she was in the hallway for about 10 minutes.
Okay.
I did just stand there, just staring. Looking back at it, it's so jumbled in my head.
Yeah.
What were you doing in those 10 minutes before you moved her?
Well, I stood there, then I walked over to the couch and I sat down and I looked over at her. And then I looked down and then I looked at the TV. Then I got up and that's when I decided I should move her.
Ultimately, the decision to move his mother's body really seems like it was more about a convenience for him, that it was just offensive and messy.
So this all happened Friday night. Were you at home up until today?
Yeah.
I think I covered this. I just want to double check between Friday and then today. Have you left the house at all?
Yeah, to get more alcohol.
What would you buy down there?
Just Fireball and a pack of cigarettes.
How many times did you go down there in those 4 days?
I think twice.
Twice?
Were you watching TV, or?
I was playing games and watching TV, yeah.
You have to think about at that point, 5 days with a dead body that you're living near, it's going to start smelling. He was sitting there playing video games. He was kind of living this fantasy life where no one was bothering him.
His decision to go about his daily routine, playing video games, continuing to drink, continuing to watch television as if life is normal, could be both his own way of processing and coping with what he had just done, that he just distances himself from it psychologically. It may also be a very clear indication of the shallow affect and the lack of empathy and remorse that this very psychopathic individual experiences.
Okay, did you call or tell anybody about this in the last 5 days?
No, just my mom's friend today.
All right. What made you come to that?
Conscience.
All right.
It's a heavy weight on my heart.
Yeah. Okay. So after you spoke with Lori, what did you do after you told her what had happened?
I left the house and I just went up to Walmart and waited in their parking lot.
What did you do there?
I just sat in there. I went inside and I bought some popcorn chicken and I went back to the truck and ate it.
Someone who has a conscience and a heavy heart is probably not the same person who, after admitting to a murder, drives to Walmart and goes and eats popcorn chicken in their car.
So he had called a couple times. And then I saw that, he had called probably 30 minutes later or something and called him back. And he said, well, I can't continue to lie to you. I killed her. And then he just went, he just paused, like that was also, I don't know, matter of factly.
Right.
Thompson's actually utilizing the same passive approach to his life that he always has. He doesn't make any decisions. He lets the world come to him, and he lets life happen to him. He didn't turn himself in right after he killed her. He turned himself in after his mother's friend discovered that she was missing, and he started to realize people would start coming around to the house.
Is he working right now?
Ted, no.
He doesn't work? Okay.
He worked at the cold storage, and then he started somewhere else and didn't like it. And I can't remember what place that was, but then it's been probably a couple months.
Okay.
But he has like a felony, like he's so with the record.
There are multiple instances of Mr. Thompson's problematic behavior, starting with early teens. So for instance, he's staying with a friend. When they ask him to wash the dishes, he gets upset and ultimately ends up trying to run over them with a vehicle. And in another instance, he is staying with a different family friend, and this family friend asks him to leave, and he threatens them with a knife.
Thompson is really showing us an individual who can't deal with his emotions. He doesn't know how to deal with disappointment, with rejection, with rage. He also has a very low threshold for when those emotions kick in. If he's asked to do anything he doesn't want to do, like a spoiled child, he tantrums.
Before we go on, can I say that there is a cat there that's one of our rescue cats?
Okay.
So I'm not sure what's going on at the house, but I need to get the cat out of there.
Is there a cat at the house?
There was.
Okay. Where's the cat?
It's gone.
Okay, what happened to the cat?
Just got rid of it.
Bye-bye.
Did you kill the cat?
Yes, I killed the cat.
How'd you kill it?
I just broke it.
Like, with your hands, or?
No, with the crowbar, too.
Where's the cat now?
I threw it in the trash.
Out back?
In the big garbage can, yeah.
In the big garbage can?
I was still pissed. Everything about Mom, everything's hers.
When did you kill the cat?
Right after.
Individuals who exhibit extreme levels of antisociality as well as psychopathy do sometimes have a pattern of harming animals. Sometimes they harm animals because they're more vulnerable. They are easy to coerce and to control. He just doesn't seem connected to the value for life.
In the end, there's no point running. Right. Did you have, like, any idea of where you might actually go to?
No.
Okay. That's another reason, too. Like, what's the point? Okay. And instead, I'll just do the right thing.
I couldn't barely sleep after this. Like,
were you sleeping in your room or out in the living room?
I was sleeping in my room, and I would keep waking up with fits, and it was horrible.
Thompson acknowledges that he had some difficulty sleeping, knowing that his dead mother was in the other room. But for days, he continued going about his daily routine. He left the house. He went to the liquor store and got more alcohol, as if he hadn't just killed his mother. We have to wonder, if a friend had not noticed that she was missing, how long would Thompson have continued living in the home with his decomposing mother?
I'm glad as you said, I actually feel a lot better now.
Thompson describes a sense of relief, and you see that in his posture and how he talks about things. No doubt he's probably happy to get these things off his chest, but the relief may be stemming from the fact that a woman that he hated is now gone. And he took control of his life for the first time and did what he needed to do to get rid of somebody who he felt was just so mean and negative toward him. But what we don't see is any real ability to take responsibility for what he did. He's using the words, he's fully admitting what he did. He makes no real attempts to cover up his behavior. He's just a pretty straightforward, simplistic, and concrete thinker who, I think that concrete behavior really stems from a lack of feeling bad. He's not experiencing any real remorse or regret for his actions.
Ultimately, he's confessed, it's over. Now he doesn't even have to worry about the real cleanup of her body. He can just move on to an incarceration where he won't have to take care of himself yet again. He doesn't have to take care of the mess that he created at the house, and he can go on to the next stage of his life, basically allowing someone else to care for him.
No matter how, look at it, my life's over now, huh? Well, oh. Pretty much.
On the morning of April 15th, 1984, Brooklyn woke to what should have been a day of reflection. It was Palm Sunday, the beginning of Holy Week, a day when church bells would soon echo through neighborhoods across New York City and families would gather before attending religious services or sharing meals together. In Williamsburg, a community shaped by generations of immigrants, narrow streets slowly came alive as shopkeepers unlocked their storefronts and residents stepped outside to greet another ordinary spring morning. Nothing about the weather hinted that this day would be remembered for anything other than faith, family, and tradition. Yet hidden behind the ordinary facade of a three-story brick building at 116 Moore Street, events were quietly unfolding that would transform this peaceful Sunday into one of the most haunting unsolved mass shootings in New York City's history. More than 4 decades later, investigators still cannot say with certainty who pulled the triggers or why so many lives were taken. The answers may have disappeared with the killers themselves, leaving behind only fragments of evidence, unanswered questions, and families who have spent years waiting for justice that has never arrived. To understand the horror of what happened that morning, it is necessary to begin long before the first gunshot echoed through the second-floor apartment. During the early 1980s, Williamsburg was a neighborhood of striking contrasts. It was home to hardworking families, local businesses, churches, and close-knit communities, but it was also struggling under the weight of economic hardship. Unemployment, drugs, illegal gambling, and organized criminal activity had become familiar realities in certain parts of the neighborhood. Residents often learned to keep their heads down, avoid unnecessary questions, and mind their own business. Trust between local communities and law enforcement was fragile, and many disputes were settled without involving the police. Against that backdrop, places that appeared ordinary from the outside often served very different purposes behind closed doors. One such place stood at 116 Moore Street. From the sidewalk, there was little to distinguish the building from dozens of others nearby. Its aging brick exterior blended naturally into the surrounding block, giving no indication that people regularly gathered upstairs for activities that operated outside the law. The second-floor apartment had gradually become an informal gambling club where friends and acquaintances, most of them Puerto Rican men from the neighborhood, spent weekends playing poker, placing bets, drinking beer, listening to music, and escaping the pressures of daily life for a few hours. According to investigators, it was not considered a sophisticated casino controlled by major organized crime families. Instead, it functioned as a familiar gathering place where money changed hands, cards were dealt across folding tables, and conversations stretched for hours. On busy weekends, several $1,000s could circulate through the games, making the apartment a location known to many local residents. The men who gathered there represented different walks of life. Some had previous encounters with the criminal justice system involving gambling, drugs, or gang activity. Others simply came to enjoy the company of longtime friends, neighbors, or relatives. The club existed somewhere in the blurred space between social gathering and illegal enterprise, where people who otherwise lived ordinary lives occasionally crossed paths with individuals connected to more dangerous worlds. That complicated mix would later make the investigation extraordinarily difficult, because determining who had been an intended target and who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time became nearly impossible. Palm Sunday arrived like countless Sundays before it. Throughout Brooklyn, churches prepared for services commemorating the beginning of Holy Week. Families planned their schedules around religious observances, while others simply enjoyed the quiet pace of a weekend morning. Inside the apartment at 116 Moore Street, approximately 25 to 30 people gradually gathered. Some sat around card tables engaged in poker games. Others leaned against walls with cups of coffee or bottles of beer in their hands. Conversations overlapped as friends laughed, discussed neighborhood news, watched the games unfold, and settled into what appeared to be another routine weekend gathering. There was no indication that anyone sensed immediate danger. There were no reports of arguments escalating into violence, no warning signs that panic was about to replace casual conversation. To everyone inside, the morning seemed entirely ordinary. That ordinary atmosphere would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire case. Unlike crimes that unfold after visible confrontations or prolonged disputes, this tragedy appeared to emerge without warning. At some point during the morning, the normal rhythm of conversation would be interrupted forever. But before that moment arrived, the apartment remained a place where people believed they were among familiar faces. Some participants focused intently on the cards in front of them. Others exchanged stories about work, family, or neighborhood events. Empty beer bottles slowly accumulated on nearby tables. Cigarette smoke drifted through the room. Money moved across the card tables as bets were won and lost. Outside, life continued as it always had. Pedestrians walked along Moore Street unaware that dozens of people were gathered only one floor above them. Passing drivers had no reason to notice the building. Nothing suggested that within minutes, police officers, detectives, ambulances, and crime scene investigators would descend upon the same address. The contrast between the calm outside and the violence that would soon erupt inside has remained one of the defining characteristics of the Palm Sunday massacre. Investigators would later conclude that the attack was not random. Everything about the killer's actions suggested planning, purpose, and familiarity with their objective. Yet at this stage of the story, none of the people inside the apartment knew they had become part of that plan. The gathering continued exactly as it had on previous weekends, following routines that had become almost predictable. Familiar face para familiar seats. The apartment's reputation as a neighborhood gambling spot meant those present likely expected nothing more dangerous than the possibility of losing money at the card table. Instead, they were unknowingly approaching the final ordinary moments of their lives. In the years that followed, detectives would interview hundreds of people, revisit countless theories, and examine every available lead. They would discover that the events of that Sunday morning had left behind far more questions than answers. Why was this apartment chosen? Who had truly been the intended target? Was the massacre connected to illegal gambling, organized crime, personal revenge, or something else entirely? Those questions remain unanswered because the violence that erupted inside 116 Moore Street produced remarkably few certainties beyond the devastating human cost. Before the first emergency call reached authorities, before investigators began collecting shell casings from the blood-covered floor, before surviving witnesses struggled to recall the terrifying minutes that changed their lives forever, the apartment was simply another gathering place hidden within a neighborhood accustomed to keeping its secrets. Then, sometime after 10:30 that morning, footsteps approached the entrance. The door opened, and within moments, the ordinary sounds of conversation and playing cards would be replaced by commands, gunfire, and a mystery that has remained unsolved for more than 40 years. By approximately 10:30 that Sunday morning, the gathering inside the second-floor apartment at 116 Moore Street had settled into a familiar rhythm. Around 25 to 30 people occupied the modest space, their attention divided between poker games, casual conversations, and drinks shared among friends. Some leaned over card tables, studying their hands with quiet concentration, while others watched from nearby chairs, occasionally offering advice or friendly criticism. Coffee cups and beer bottles rested beside scattered playing cards, and the atmosphere reflected what regular visitors had come to expect from these weekend meetings. Although the apartment operated as an illegal gambling club, it was also a social space where neighbors and acquaintances spent hours together. For many of the men present that morning, there was little reason to believe this Sunday would be remembered differently from countless others. Outside, Williamsburg continued its ordinary routine. Families prepared for Palm Sunday church services. Small businesses welcomed customers beginning their day. Cars traveled through nearby streets without slowing as they passed the aging brick building on Moore Street. The neighborhood gave no outward indication that one of the deadliest unsolved shootings in New York City's history was only moments away. The contrast between the peaceful streets below and the unsuspecting gathering upstairs would later become one of the most haunting elements of the case. Violence arrived not in the middle of chaos, but in the middle of routine. According to the testimony later provided by the two surviving victims, the attack began suddenly. At least 2 armed men entered the apartment. Investigators have long considered the possibility that a third accomplice remained outside to act as a lookout. Although that theory has never been conclusively proven, what the surviving witnesses consistently described was the calm and deliberate manner in which the attackers carried themselves. They were not rushing. They were not shouting in panic. Instead, they appeared to know exactly what they intended to accomplish from the moment they crossed the doorway. Their faces were largely concealed by masks or coverings, making later identification nearly impossible. The attackers were also armed with large-caliber handguns. Evidence recovered from the crime scene would later indicate that more than one firearm had been used during the assault, suggesting coordination rather than spontaneous violence. Their arrival instantly transformed the atmosphere inside the apartment. Only seconds earlier, people had been focused on card games and conversations. Now I turned toward the armed strangers standing inside the room. At first, many believed they were witnessing an armed robbery. Such crimes were not unheard of in neighborhoods where illegal gambling operations handled cash. If robbers wanted money, the victims may have believed compliance offered the best chance of survival. That assumption would prove tragically wrong. The gunman issued commands in both English and Spanish, ordering everyone to get down. The instruction was simple, direct, and unmistakable. Those inside complied almost immediately. Men dropped to their knees or lay face down on the floor. Hands were raised. No reports suggested that anyone attempted to fight back or reach for a weapon. There was no prolonged confrontation and no exchange of gunfire. The victims did exactly what armed intruders typically demand during a robbery. They surrendered control in the hope that cooperation would spare their lives. Instead, it placed them in positions from which they could neither escape nor defend themselves. Investigators would later conclude that this detail revealed something important about the nature of the attack. The killers had not entered firing wildly. They first established complete control over the room. Only after every victim had been subdued did the shooting begin. This sequence strongly suggested preparation rather than impulse. Whatever the motive may have been, the attackers appeared determined to eliminate resistance before carrying out the next stage of their plan. Then the gunfire erupted. According to the subsequent investigation, many victims were shot at close range. Medical examinations revealed that numerous victims suffered gunshot wounds to the head or upper body, while several were struck multiple times. The pattern of injuries indicated that this was not indiscriminate firing directed into a crowded room. Instead, investigators described the killings as systematic. The attackers moved through the apartment, firing repeatedly into victims who had already obeyed every command. Witness testimony and forensic evidence suggested that the gunmen continued checking the room as they advanced. If someone showed signs of movement, additional shots were fired. Some victims were struck 4, 5, or even 6 times. These details led detectives to characterize the crime not as a robbery gone wrong, but as a deliberate execution carried out with extraordinary efficiency. The entire assault is believed to have lasted only a matter of minutes. Yet within that brief period, the apartment was transformed into a devastating crime scene. 8 men lost their lives before emergency responders could arrive. Blood spread across the wooden floor. Furniture was overturned amid the chaos. Playing cards, gambling chips, bottles, and personal belongings remained scattered exactly where they had fallen as panic replaced the ordinary routine of only moments before. Amid the violence, 2 men survived, though only by circumstances that investigators and medical personnel later described as remarkable. The first survivor suffered a gunshot wound to the head and face. Although the injury was severe, the bullet did not penetrate the brain. Realizing that any sign of movement could draw additional gunfire, he remained perfectly still among the bodies surrounding him. Pretending to be dead became his only chance of survival. Nearby, the second survivor had also been struck by gunfire. Wounded in the neck and shoulder area, he lost a significant amount of blood, but likewise resisted any instinct to move or call for help. He understood that remaining motionless offered the greatest possibility that the attackers would leave without discovering he was still alive. Their decisions to feign death almost certainly saved their lives. According to the reconstruction accepted by investigators, the attackers eventually concluded their work and departed the apartment. Whether they left immediately or paused briefly to ensure there were no remaining witnesses remains unknown. No reliable description exists of the direction they traveled after leaving the building. If a third accomplice had indeed been waiting outside, no witness was able to provide sufficient information to identify that individual either. In only a few minutes, the killers disappeared from Moore Street, leaving behind one of the largest unsolved homicide scenes New York City had experienced. Silence returned to the apartment, but it was a silence unlike anything that had existed before. The card games had ended forever. Conversations had been replaced by the stillness of death. For the 2 wounded survivors, the next moments were filled with uncertainty. Neither could immediately know whether the gunman might return. Remaining alive no longer depended on pretending to be dead. It depended on finding help before their injuries claimed their lives. Only after they believed the attackers had left did they finally move. Despite severe wounds, they managed to summon emergency assistance. Their actions initiated the law enforcement response that would soon bring police officers, detectives, paramedics, and crime scene investigators rushing toward Moore Street. The first responders who entered the apartment encountered a scene that veteran investigators would later describe as among the bloodiest they had witnessed. 8 victims lay dead across the room where only minutes earlier they had been gambling and talking with friends. Shell casings were scattered across the floor. Furniture had been knocked aside during the attack. Blood covered large sections of the apartment. Although emergency personnel focused first on saving the 2 surviving victims, detectives immediately recognized that they faced an investigation of extraordinary complexity. The attack had been swift, organized, and devastatingly effective. Even before the first interviews began, one unsettling realization was already becoming clear. Whoever had planned the massacre appeared to have anticipated almost every obstacle investigators would later encounter. The killers had concealed their identities, left within minutes, and vanished into the streets of Brooklyn without leaving behind any obvious path toward identification. The apartment at 116 Moore Street had become more than a homicide scene. It had become the starting point of a mystery that, despite decades of investigation, would remain unresolved long after the blood on its floor had dried. As emergency responders secured the apartment and transported the 2 surviving victims for medical treatment, detectives from the New York City Police Department began the painstaking process of examining what had become one of the most disturbing crime scenes in the city's recent history. Every investigation begins with a single objective: determine what happened before asking why it happened. At 116 Moore Street, however, even reconstructing the sequence of events presented extraordinary challenges. The apartment had long served as a gathering place where dozens of people regularly came and went. Friends, neighbors, gamblers, and visitors had passed through the rooms over countless weekends. That constant traffic meant fingerprints, footprints, and other physical traces were unlikely to belong exclusively to the killers. Investigators quickly realized they would need to separate years of ordinary activity from the evidence left behind during only a few terrifying minutes on the morning of April 15, 1984. The first observations inside the apartment painted a picture of overwhelming violence. Bodies were found throughout the room, some lying close together where they had obeyed the gunman's command to get down. Others remained near tables where poker games had been interrupted without warning. Blood covered large portions of the wooden floor, while overturned chairs and scattered playing cards remained exactly where they had fallen. Beer bottles, coffee cups, gambling chips, and personal belongings sat untouched, frozen in place by the sudden interruption of ordinary life. To experienced homicide investigators, crime scenes often tell stories that witnesses cannot. In this apartment, one detail immediately stood out. Although the room had clearly contained cash associated with gambling activities, money remained at the scene. Detectives also noted that jewelry, watches, and other valuables belonging to several victims had not been taken. If robbery had been the primary objective, the attackers had ignored obvious opportunities to steal property before escaping. That observation quickly began shifting the direction of the investigation. The evidence suggested that the purpose of entering the apartment had not been financial gain. Instead, the gunman appeared focused almost entirely on killing the people inside. Another critical element came from the pattern of the gunshot wounds documented during the investigation. Numerous victims had suffered wounds to the head or upper body, and several had been struck multiple times. Combined with witness testimony from the 2 survivors, detectives concluded that the attack had been carried out systematically rather than randomly. The victims had complied with the attackers' orders. They had lain face down or knelt without resisting. Yet the shooters continued moving through the apartment, firing repeatedly and, according to investigators, shooting again if they observed movement. Such behavior reinforced the belief that this had been a deliberate execution rather than a robbery that escalated unexpectedly into murder. Every piece of evidence seemed to point toward careful planning, disciplined execution, and a willingness to leave no witnesses behind. The fact that 2 men survived appeared to result not from mercy, but from extraordinary luck and the split-second decision to remain perfectly still despite devastating injuries. Once the initial forensic examination was underway, detectives turned their attention to the survivors. Their testimony represented the only direct account of the attack itself. Despite their severe injuries, both men described remarkably similar sequences of events. They recalled that at least 2 armed men entered the apartment. Their faces were concealed by masks or other coverings, preventing any meaningful identification. The attackers issued commands in both English and Spanish, ordering everyone to get down. Their behavior was calm and controlled rather than emotional or frantic. Neither survivor could provide a detailed physical description beyond these general observations, because both had been forced to face the floor almost immediately after the attackers entered. The shooting unfolded so rapidly that opportunities to study the gunman simply did not exist. Detectives pressed for every possible detail. Did the attackers have distinctive voices? Did either survivor recognize an accent? Was there anything unusual about the clothing, height, or movements of the gunman? Unfortunately, the answers remained frustratingly limited. Fear, confusion, physical trauma, and the speed of the assault combined to leave investigators with descriptions too vague to identify specific suspects. While understandable under such extreme circumstances, the lack of identifiable features represented one of the earliest and most significant obstacles in the case. As the investigation expanded, police interviewed family members of the victims, neighbors, and individuals known to frequent the gambling club. Hundreds of interviews followed in an effort to understand the relationships among those present. Inside the apartment, detectives hoped that by reconstructing the social connections surrounding the gathering, they might discover whether one individual had been the intended target or whether the attack had been directed against the group as a whole. It soon became apparent that the victims represented a mixture of backgrounds. Some had prior involvement with illegal gambling, drugs, or gang-related activity. Others appeared to have simply been participating in the weekend gathering without any known connection to organized criminal enterprises. This diversity complicated every investigative theory. If only one or two individuals had been targeted, why kill so many others? Conversely, if the entire group had been marked for death, what common factor connected them all? Those questions would continue to haunt detectives throughout the investigation. One theory quickly rose to prominence. Because the apartment functioned as an illegal gambling establishment, and some victims reportedly had links to criminal activity, investigators considered whether the massacre represented retaliation connected to organized crime, gambling disputes, or narcotics trafficking. Such acts of violence were not unprecedented in environments where illegal businesses operated. Outside legal protections, financial disagreements, territorial conflicts, or perceived betrayals sometimes resulted in deadly consequences. Nevertheless, despite examining these possibilities extensively, detectives were unable to identify sufficient evidence connecting any specific criminal organization or gang to the killings. Suspicion alone could not support arrests, and no witness came forward with information capable of confirming the theory. Another possibility involved personal revenge. Investigators considered whether the killers may have entered the apartment intending to eliminate one or two specific individuals, with everyone else becoming victims simply because they were present. The systematic nature of the shooting appeared consistent with an effort to eliminate witnesses. Yet this explanation also encountered serious problems. Without knowing who the intended target might have been, investigators could not establish a convincing motive or identify likely suspects. Every potential answer generated new questions instead of resolving existing ones. Detectives also revisited the robbery theory despite the evidence suggesting otherwise. It remained possible, at least in principle, that robbers had abandoned their original objective after violence erupted. However, the physical evidence consistently weakened that interpretation. Money remained inside the apartment. Valuable personal property remained on the victims. The attackers spent precious time firing multiple rounds into victims instead of collecting cash and escaping quickly. Such actions appeared inconsistent with criminals primarily motivated by theft. As investigators compared each competing explanation against the available evidence, robbery steadily became one of the least convincing scenarios. During the course of the investigation, authorities also examined whether known violent offenders operating in New York during the period could be responsible. Among those considered was Joseph Christopher, whose criminal activities had drawn significant attention during the early 1980s. Detectives reviewed the possibility carefully, but ultimately concluded that important differences separated Christopher's known crimes from the Palm Sunday massacre. His methods, victim selection, and patterns of offending did not align with the organized, multi-victim execution that had occurred at Moore Street. Without direct evidence linking him to the scene, investigators eliminated him as a viable suspect. While detectives pursued every available lead, another challenge steadily became more apparent. Many individuals familiar with the gambling club appeared reluctant to cooperate fully with law Enforcement, fear of retaliation, distrust of police, and possible involvement in illegal activities all discouraged potential witnesses from speaking openly. Investigators understood that someone in the community might possess critical information about the motive or identity of the attackers. Yet convincing those individuals to come forward proved extraordinarily difficult. Silence gradually became one of the defining features of the case. Each interview that produced few answers deepened the sense that the truth remained hidden behind a wall of fear. By the end of the initial investigative phase, detectives had established several facts with reasonable confidence. They believed at least 2 masked gunmen had entered the apartment. They believed the victims had complied with orders before being systematically shot. They believed robbery was unlikely to have been the primary motive. They believed the attack had been carefully planned rather than spontaneous. Beyond those conclusions, certainty became increasingly elusive. The names of the killers remained unknown. Their motive remained uncertain. The surviving witnesses could not identify them. The physical evidence revealed the brutality of the crime, but not the identities of those responsible. What had begun as an intensive homicide investigation was slowly evolving into one of New York City's most enduring unsolved mysteries. A case in which every confirmed fact seemed surrounded by even greater uncertainty. As the first weeks of the investigation gave way to months, the Palm Sunday massacre began to reveal one of the most frustrating realities of major homicide investigations. Solving a crime depends not only on the evidence collected at the scene, but also on the willingness of people to speak. In many cases, detectives eventually identify inconsistencies, uncover overlooked witnesses, or receive anonymous tips that gradually connect isolated pieces of information into a coherent picture. At 116 Moore Street, however, that process never unfolded as investigators had hoped. Instead, every promising lead seemed to dissolve under closer examination, leaving detectives with a growing collection of theories but very few verifiable answers. The investigation expanded far beyond the apartment itself. Detectives attempted to reconstruct the lives of every victim, examining friendships, family relationships, gambling activities, and any known involvement with illegal enterprises. The goal was straightforward: identify whether one particular individual stood out as a likely target. If investigators could determine who the killers intended to eliminate, they believed the motive might finally become clear. Yet the more information they gathered, the more complicated the picture became. Some victims reportedly had previous involvement with gambling operations, narcotics, or gang-related activities. Others appeared to have no significant criminal history beyond attending the gambling club itself. Because the group represented a mixture of backgrounds, detectives struggled to identify a single connection shared by everyone present. The apartment had long functioned as a meeting place where people from different circumstances gathered together. That reality created a difficult investigative problem. If the killers were seeking revenge against one specific person, why murder so many others? If the entire gathering had been targeted, what common interest united every victim? Neither explanation could be confirmed using the available evidence. Detectives therefore continued examining multiple theories simultaneously, hoping that new information would eventually eliminate all but one. The theory that attracted the greatest attention remained retaliation connected to illegal gambling or organized criminal activity. Investigators knew the apartment operated outside the law and that money regularly changed hands. During weekend card games, in environments where illegal businesses operate, disputes over territory, unpaid debts, or perceived betrayals can escalate into violence. Because some of the victims reportedly had previous associations with criminal activity, detectives carefully explored whether the massacre represented a calculated warning directed at others operating within the same underground economy. Nevertheless, despite extensive interviews and background investigations, authorities found no evidence capable of identifying a particular criminal organization or proving that any specific dispute had directly led to the attack. Suspicion alone was not enough to build a criminal case. Every potential connection required corroboration, and that corroboration never materialized. Another persistent obstacle involved the atmosphere surrounding the neighborhood itself. Williamsburg during the early 1980s was a community where many residents viewed cooperation with law enforcement cautiously. Some feared retaliation if they shared information about violent offenders. Others worried that speaking openly might expose their own involvement in illegal gambling or unrelated criminal activity. Even individuals with no criminal history could hesitate if they believed their families or neighbors might suffer consequences for assisting investigators. Detectives recognized this silence as one of the greatest barriers confronting the case. They believed someone likely possessed information capable of explaining the motive or identifying the attackers. Yet convincing that person to come forward proved extraordinarily difficult. Interview after interview produced fragments of information, but rarely the decisive breakthrough investigators desperately needed. At the same time, detectives continued reviewing the physical evidence recovered from the apartment. Numerous shell casings had been collected from the crime scene, confirming that multiple shots had been fired during the massacre. Investigators also documented the positions of the victims, the distribution of blood evidence, and the locations of furniture overturned during the attack. Those findings strengthened the reconstruction established during the earliest stages of the investigation. The victims had obeyed the attacker's commands before the shooting began. The gunman then moved deliberately through the room, firing at close range and, according to the investigation, shooting again if movement was observed. This reconstruction consistently reinforced the conclusion that the killings represented a planned execution rather than a spontaneous eruption of violence. Yet forensic science in 1984 had significant limitations compared with the capabilities available. Decades later, DNA profiling had not yet become a routine investigative tool, and many forms of modern forensic analysis simply did not exist. Even if biological evidence had been present, detectives lacked the technology that later generations of investigators would consider standard. Consequently, many questions that might today be addressed through advanced laboratory techniques remained unanswered. Physical evidence documented what had happened inside the apartment but could do little to identify who had carried out the crime. Throughout the investigation, detectives also revisited the possibility that the attack had been motivated by robbery despite the evidence pointing elsewhere. They challenged their own assumptions repeatedly, asking whether valuables might have been overlooked or whether circumstances forced the attackers to flee before stealing property. Each review produced the same fundamental conclusion. Money remained at the scene. Watches and jewelry belonging to victims had not been removed. Rather than searching the apartment for valuables, the gunmen devoted their attention almost entirely to shooting those present. The pattern remained inconsistent with offenders whose primary objective was financial gain. As a result, investigators continued treating robbery as an unlikely explanation while focusing greater attention on retaliation or personal revenge. During the years that followed, authorities questioned hundreds of individuals connected in various ways to the victims, the gambling club, and the surrounding neighborhood. Family members were interviewed in hopes of uncovering recent disputes or threats. Friends were asked whether anyone had expressed fear before the massacre. Regular visitors to the apartment were questioned about gambling operations, financial disagreements, and possible conflicts involving those who gathered there. Individuals suspected of involvement in local criminal organizations also came under scrutiny. Some were subjected to extensive interviews, while others reportedly underwent polygraph examinations during the course of the broader investigation. Despite the sheer volume of investigative work, none of these efforts produced evidence sufficient to justify criminal charges. Every promising lead eventually reached the same frustrating conclusion: not enough proof. Investigators also considered whether the massacre could be linked to other violent crimes occurring in New York during that period. One name examined was Joseph Christopher, a known serial killer whose crimes had already attracted public attention. Detectives explored the possibility carefully because Christopher had operated in New York during roughly the same era. Ultimately, however, important differences emerged. His established methods, victim selection, and overall pattern of offending differed substantially from the systematic, coordinated attack carried out inside the Moore Street apartment, without physical evidence or reliable witness testimony connecting him to the massacre. Investigators eliminated him as a suspect. That decision underscored an important principle guiding the investigation. Similarities in geography or timing alone could not substitute for evidence. Detectives remained determined to avoid building a case upon speculation rather than facts. As the years passed, the investigation gradually entered a different phase. Instead of actively pursuing fresh crime scenes or newly identified suspects, detectives increasingly revisited existing evidence, searching for details that might have been overlooked. Advances in forensic science offered hope that older cases could eventually benefit from technologies unavailable during the original investigation. In 2019, authorities announced that certain physical evidence associated with the Palm Sunday massacre was being reviewed using more modern forensic techniques. The announcement reflected the continuing belief that even decades-old investigations can produce unexpected breakthroughs when re-examined through the lens of scientific progress. Yet despite renewed attention, no publicly announced breakthrough followed. No arrests were made. No suspect was formally identified. The case remained officially unsolved. For the families of those killed, the passage of time brought no clear resolution. Birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays arrived year after year, each serving as another reminder that the people responsible had never been brought before a court. The two surviving victims carried not only the physical consequences of the attack, but also the burden of knowing they had witnessed one of New York City's most notorious unsolved mass killings, while remaining unable to identify the men responsible. Their testimony established the framework of what happened inside the apartment, but it could not answer the questions investigators continued asking decades later. Who planned the attack? Why was 116 Moore Street chosen? Were the killers targeting one individual or everyone present? Did someone outside the apartment know exactly what was going to happen? Those questions remained unanswered not because investigators failed to search for them, but because every path toward the truth eventually disappeared into silence. Today, the Palm Sunday massacre stands as both a devastating act of violence and a reminder of the limits of even the most determined criminal investigation. Detectives reconstructed the sequence of events with considerable confidence. They established that the attack had been deliberate, systematic, and almost certainly planned in advance. They ruled out several possible explanations while carefully examining others. They interviewed hundreds of people, pursued numerous investigative avenues, and continued reviewing evidence decades after the crime itself. Yet despite those efforts, the central mystery endured. The identities of the gunmen, their precise motive, and the full story behind one of Brooklyn's darkest mornings remain hidden, leaving the Palm Sunday massacre not only among New York City's deadliest unsolved shootings, but also among its most enduring unanswered questions. More than 4 decades have passed since the morning of April 15, 1984. Yet the Palm Sunday massacre continues to occupy a unique place in the history of unsolved violent crime in New York City. Unlike many notorious homicide investigations that eventually reached a courtroom, this case never progressed beyond the investigative stage. No suspect was ever formally charged. No jury heard evidence. No defense attorney challenged the prosecution's theory. No judge delivered a verdict. The legal process that families often depend upon for answers and accountability simply never began. Instead, the case became an enduring reminder that not every crime, no matter how thoroughly investigated or how devastating its consequences, ultimately reaches a conclusion within the justice system. For detectives assigned to the investigation over the years, The absence of an arrest did not mean the work had ended. Homicide cases of this magnitude are rarely considered closed merely because time has passed. Investigators continued preserving evidence, reviewing witness statements, and maintaining case files in the hope that a new piece of information might eventually emerge. Advances in forensic science have transformed many cold case investigations, allowing detectives to revisit physical evidence collected decades earlier using technologies that did not exist when the crimes occurred. In the Palm Sunday massacre investigation, authorities announced in 2019 that certain physical evidence was being re-examined with modern forensic methods. The decision reflected both technological progress and an enduring commitment to solving one of New York City's most infamous unsolved shootings. Yet, despite renewed analysis, no public announcement followed indicating that the review had produced a breakthrough. The identities of the gunmen remained unknown, and the central questions that had haunted the investigation since 1984 remained unanswered. Throughout the years, investigators consistently returned to the same fundamental theories. The possibility of organized criminal retaliation continued to receive serious consideration because of the illegal gambling operation conducted inside the apartment and the reported criminal backgrounds of some victims. Detectives understood that disputes involving gambling, narcotics, or criminal organizations sometimes produced calculated acts of violence intended to intimidate others or settle unresolved conflicts. However, suspicion requires evidence before it can become proof. Although investigators explored those connections extensively, no witness document or piece of physical evidence established responsibility on the part of any specific organization or individual. Equally persistent was the theory that only one or two people inside the apartment had been the true targets and that everyone else had been murdered simply to eliminate witnesses. The systematic manner in which the gunmen moved through the room supported the possibility that they intended to leave no survivors. Yet that theory also remained incomplete because investigators never determined with confidence who the primary target might have been. Without identifying the intended victim, the search for motive repeatedly reached the same dead end. The robbery theory, by contrast, gradually lost credibility as investigators continued evaluating the available evidence. Money remained inside the apartment. Personal valuables were left untouched. The attackers devoted their time to killing rather than stealing. Every significant observation pointed toward murder as the objective rather than theft. As years passed, this conclusion became one of the few aspects of the case that investigators regarded with relative confidence. The attack appeared designed to end lives, not to obtain property. Another aspect that continued to frustrate investigators involved the limited descriptions provided by the two surviving witnesses. Their inability to identify the attackers was never viewed as a failure on their part. On the contrary, detectives recognized that the circumstances made detailed observations nearly impossible. The gunmen concealed their faces. Victims were immediately ordered to lie face down. The shooting unfolded within only a few minutes under conditions of extreme fear and confusion. The survivors' testimony proved invaluable in reconstructing the sequence of events, confirming that at least two armed men entered the apartment, issued commands in English and Spanish, and carried out the attack in a calm and deliberate manner. Nevertheless, their accounts could not supply names, recognizable facial features, or distinctive characteristics capable of identifying the killers. Those limitations reflected the realities of surviving an event marked by overwhelming violence, rather than shortcomings in the witnesses themselves. The investigation also highlighted another challenge that often confronts cases involving illegal enterprises. Communities affected by organized criminal activity frequently struggle with fear, distrust, and silence. Investigators believe that individuals within the neighborhood may have possessed information about the gambling club, the victims, or potential motives behind the massacre. Yet fear of retaliation, reluctance to become involved with law enforcement, and concerns about exposing illegal activities created barriers that proved extraordinarily difficult to overcome. Detectives conducted hundreds of interviews over the years, speaking with relatives, neighbors, regular visitors to the gambling club, and individuals believed to have connections with local criminal circles. Some people reportedly underwent polygraph examinations. Others were questioned repeatedly as investigators revisited earlier statements searching for inconsistencies or overlooked details. Despite those extensive efforts, no witness ultimately provided evidence sufficient to support criminal charges. Every promising lead eventually faded under scrutiny. In the absence of arrests or prosecutions, the Palm Sunday massacre gradually entered the category of cases commonly described as cold, though the designation does not imply abandonment. Cold cases remain active in the sense that investigators continue reviewing evidence whenever new technologies, fresh information, or renewed public attention create opportunities for progress. Each advancement in forensic science raises the possibility that evidence once considered inconclusive may reveal something previously hidden. Every anniversary of the massacre also serves as a reminder that unresolved investigations can still change. Even after decades of silence, history has shown that some of the world's most difficult homicide cases have eventually been solved through patient re-examination of preserved evidence. Whether such a breakthrough will ever occur in the Palm Sunday massacre remains unknown. Beyond the investigation itself lies the lasting human impact of the crime. 8 men lost their lives during what began as an ordinary Sunday gathering among friends and acquaintances. 2 others survived only by pretending to be dead after suffering life-threatening gunshot wounds. Families endured not only the sudden loss of loved ones, but also the prolonged uncertainty that accompanies every unsolved homicide. Unlike families whose cases proceed through arrests and trials, they never had the opportunity to hear prosecutors present a complete account of the crime before a jury. They never witnessed a judicial determination of guilt or innocence. Instead, they were left with an official investigation that established many facts about how the massacre occurred, but could not answer the most important question of all: who was responsible? That uncertainty became part of the legacy of the crime itself. Today, the building at 116 Moore Street no longer represents merely an address in Brooklyn. Within the history of New York City, it has become a symbol of one of the darkest unsolved chapters in the city's struggle against violent crime during the 1980s. The massacre demonstrated how quickly ordinary moments can be shattered by calculated violence, and how even extensive police investigations can encounter limits imposed by fear, missing evidence, and the passage of time. It also serves as a reminder that the true measure of such tragedies should never be found solely in the mystery surrounding the perpetrators. The lasting significance lies equally in remembering the victims whose lives ended inside that second-floor apartment, and in recognizing the enduring burden carried by those who survived and by the families who continue waiting for answers. More than 40 years later, investigators still cannot publicly identify the masked gunman who entered the apartment on that Palm Sunday morning. The motive remains uncertain, balanced among theories that have never been conclusively proven. The sequence of events inside the room has been reconstructed with considerable confidence. Yet the identities of those who planned and carried out the massacre remain hidden behind the silence that has surrounded the case since its earliest days. In the end, the Palm Sunday massacre stands not only as one of New York City's deadliest unsolved shootings, but also as a powerful reminder that justice is measured not simply by the effort invested in an investigation, but by whether the truth can ultimately be uncovered. Until that day arrives, if it ever does, the events of April 15, 1984, remain suspended between history and mystery, remembered not because the case was solved, but because it was never forgotten. For decades, investigators have returned to the Palm Sunday massacre with the same hope that has revived countless cold cases across the United States, that somewhere within the surviving evidence, An overlooked detail or a scientific advancement might finally reveal what had remained hidden since the spring of 1984. Yet as each year passed, the case increasingly came to represent something larger than an unsolved investigation. It became a reflection of how violence, fear, and silence can intersect to prevent even the most determined investigators from uncovering the truth. The attack at 116 Moore Street was remarkable not only because of the number of victims, but also because of the discipline displayed by those responsible. According to the evidence gathered by investigators and the testimony provided by the two surviving witnesses, the gunman entered with a clear objective, established immediate control over the room, carried out the killings in a systematic manner, and disappeared before law enforcement arrived. They concealed their identities, left behind no publicly identified suspect, and vanished into one of the largest cities in the world. Their success in avoiding identification has continued to challenge investigators for more than 40 years. One of the central questions that has never been answered concerns planning. Detectives believe the attack was unlikely to have been spontaneous. The apartment was not a public business advertised to strangers. It functioned as a gathering place where regular participants met on weekends to gamble, socialize, and spend time together. The attackers appeared to know where they were going and arrived at a time when the apartment contained a large number of people. Whether they had observed the location beforehand, received information from someone familiar with the gambling club, or selected that particular morning for another reason has never been established. The available evidence simply does not answer those questions. Nevertheless, investigators consistently viewed the attack as one requiring preparation rather than improvisation. Another enduring mystery involves the possibility of a third participant. Throughout the investigation, authorities considered whether someone may have remained outside the building to act as a lookout while the two gunmen entered the apartment. Such an arrangement would have been consistent with a coordinated operation, allowing those inside to focus entirely on controlling the victims while another individual monitored the surrounding area. However, this possibility remained only a theory. Investigators never obtained evidence sufficient to confirm the presence of an accomplice outside the building. Like many aspects of the case, it remained plausible but unproven. The distinction between theory and fact became critically important throughout the investigation. Detectives repeatedly emphasized conclusions supported by evidence while resisting the temptation to fill unanswered questions with speculation. That careful approach undoubtedly protected the integrity of the investigation, but it also meant accepting that many mysteries might never receive definitive explanations. Among the most significant unanswered questions is whether all of the victims were intended targets, or whether only one or two individuals had been marked for death. Investigators explored both possibilities extensively because each suggested a very different motive. If the attack represented retaliation against the entire gambling operation, then the massacre might have served as a warning connected to illegal gambling, narcotics activity, or organized crime. If, however, only one or two people had been the true objectives, the remaining victims may have been killed solely to eliminate witnesses capable of identifying the attackers. The systematic manner in which the shootings occurred could support either interpretation. Because investigators never identified the gunman, they also never determined which explanation most accurately reflected reality. The uncertainty surrounding motive illustrates one of the defining characteristics of unresolved homicide investigations. Knowing how a crime occurred does not necessarily explain why it happened. The Palm Sunday massacre demonstrates that distinction with striking clarity. Investigators reconstructed the sequence of events with considerable confidence. They determined that at least two masked gunmen entered the apartment, ordered everyone to lie down, and then carried out a deliberate execution. They concluded that robbery was unlikely to have been the primary objective because money and valuables remained at the scene. They established that two men survived by pretending to be dead after suffering serious gunshot wounds. Beyond those facts, however, certainty gradually gave way to probability, and probability gave way to unanswered questions. As technology advanced over subsequent decades, many cold case investigations benefited from innovations unavailable during the 1980s. DNA analysis, improvements in forensic laboratory methods, and enhanced evidence preservation transformed the way investigators approached historical crimes. Recognizing those advances, authorities revisited physical evidence associated with the Palm Sunday massacre in 2019 using more modern forensic techniques. The announcement reflected optimism that evidence collected years earlier might now reveal information impossible to detect during the original investigation. Such reviews have solved numerous cold cases elsewhere, demonstrating the extraordinary value of preserving evidence even when immediate answers remain elusive. In this investigation, however, no publicly announced breakthrough followed the renewed forensic examination. The case remained open, but its central mystery endured. The passage of time has also changed the human dimension of the investigation. Witnesses age. Memories become less precise. Individuals who may once have possessed important information sometimes become unreachable or pass away. Detectives working the case change through retirements and new assignments, requiring knowledge accumulated over decades to be carefully preserved within investigative files. Cold case investigations, therefore, involve not only evidence, but also continuity, ensuring that each generation of investigators understands the work completed by those who came before. The Palm Sunday massacre has survived this transition, remaining part of the active historical record maintained by law enforcement despite the absence of arrests. For the families of the victims, however, the investigation has never been merely an administrative file or a historical record. Behind every crime scene photograph stood a person whose absence permanently altered the lives of relatives, friends, and neighbors. Every anniversary serves as a reminder of conversations interrupted forever on that Sunday morning. The victims entered the apartment expecting a familiar gathering among people they knew. None could reasonably have anticipated becoming participants in one of New York City's most enduring unsolved homicide cases. The two survivors likewise carried forward experiences that few people could fully comprehend. Their testimony became essential to reconstructing the attack. Yet surviving such violence also meant living with memories that could never be forgotten. Although they could not identify the masked gunman, their accounts established the sequence of events that continues to shape investigators' understanding of the massacre. Without those survivors, far less would be known about how the attack unfolded inside the apartment. The legacy of the Palm Sunday massacre, therefore, extends beyond the unanswered question of who committed the crime. It also reflects the broader challenges confronting criminal investigations when witnesses fear retaliation. Physical evidence has inherent limitations, and technological capabilities lag behind investigative needs. The case demonstrates that justice depends not only on the dedication of detectives but also on circumstances often beyond their control. Even the most extensive investigative effort cannot manufacture evidence that does not exist or compel reluctant witnesses to provide information they refuse to share. Those realities make certain crimes extraordinarily difficult to solve despite years of persistent work. Today, the Palm Sunday massacre continues to be remembered as one of the deadliest unsolved shootings in the history of New York City. It occupies a place among investigations that remind both law enforcement and the public that some of history's most significant crimes remain unresolved despite enormous efforts to uncover the truth. The apartment at 116 Moore Street has long since become part of the past, but the questions born within its walls continue to echo across the decades. Who planned the attack? Who entered that room carrying concealed weapons? What conflict, grievance, or objective led to the systematic execution of 8 men while 2 others survived by extraordinary fortune alone? Those questions remain unanswered until credible new evidence emerges. The Palm Sunday Massacre will continue to stand as both a tragic chapter in New York City's history and a solemn reminder that justice is sometimes delayed not because investigators stop searching, but because the truth itself remains hidden beyond the reach of the evidence left behind. As the years moved further away from the events of April 15, 1984, the Palm Sunday Massacre gradually transformed from an active homicide investigation into one of New York City's most recognized unsolved cases. Yet the passage of time did not erase the significance of what happened inside the second floor apartment at 116 Moore Street. The number of victims, the apparent planning behind the attack, and the complete absence of identified perpetrators continued to make the case stand apart. Many investigations eventually reach a point where detectives can provide families with answers, even if those answers come after years of uncertainty. In this case, however, the investigation remained suspended between what was known and what remained impossible to prove. The facts surrounding the violence were clear. The identities and motives of those responsible were not. The inability to bring anyone to justice did not come from a lack of effort. From the earliest hours after the shooting, investigators treated the massacre as a major case requiring extensive resources. Detectives examined the crime scene, interviewed survivors, questioned hundreds of individuals, and explored multiple possible explanations. They attempted to understand not only what happened during those terrifying minutes inside the apartment, but also what circumstances had led someone to plan such a devastating attack. Every person connected to the gathering became part of the investigation. Every relationship, financial connection, and possible conflict was examined. The process was slow, detailed, and often frustrating because the evidence produced possibilities rather than definitive answers. One of the greatest challenges was the uncertainty surrounding the victims themselves. In many homicide investigations, identifying the victim's personal relationships, recent conflicts, and daily activities can reveal a direct path toward a suspect. At 116 Moore Street, however, the situation was complicated by the nature of the gathering. The apartment brought together individuals with different backgrounds. Some had connections to illegal gambling or other criminal activity, while others appeared to have attended simply as acquaintances or participants in a social gathering. This mixture made it difficult to determine whether the victims had been selected individually or collectively. Investigators had to consider whether the killers entered the apartment with specific names in mind, or whether everyone present had become a target simply because they were there. That distinction was essential because it would determine how detectives approach motive. If the attack represented a personal revenge killing, investigators needed to identify a particular conflict involving one or more victims. If it was a broader act connected to criminal organizations, they needed to uncover disputes involving gambling, money, or territorial control. Both possibilities remained open, but neither could be confirmed. The investigation repeatedly returned to the theory of organized criminal retaliation. The illegal gambling operation at 116 Moore Street naturally drew attention from detectives because it provided a possible explanation for why such a violent attack might occur. Gambling operations often involve money, debts, and disputes, and investigators considered whether the massacre could have been a message directed at individuals involved in those activities. The deliberate nature of the killings appeared consistent with a planned act of intimidation or revenge. However, despite examining this possibility, authorities could not establish a direct connection between the crime and any specific criminal organization. Without witnesses willing to provide detailed information or evidence linking particular individuals to the attack, the theory remained only a possibility. Another investigative difficulty came from the lack of reliable identification evidence. The attackers had taken steps to prevent recognition. Their faces were covered, leaving survivors unable to provide detailed descriptions. The victims had been ordered to the floor, limiting their ability to observe the gunman. The attack unfolded quickly, under conditions of extreme fear and confusion. In a different circumstance, witnesses might have remembered distinctive clothing, facial features, or other characteristics. Here, the available descriptions remain general. The survivors could confirm the presence of armed men and describe their actions, but they could not provide the kind of information necessary to create a strong identification. This limitation significantly restricted the investigation from the beginning. Physical evidence also presented challenges. The crime scene contained important information about how the attack occurred, but the technology available in 1984 was far more limited than modern forensic capabilities. Investigators could document the scene, collect shell casings, and analyze available evidence. But many techniques now considered standard in criminal investigations were not yet available. DNA analysis, which would later revolutionize cold case investigations, could not be applied in the same way. Evidence that might decades later reveal a suspect's identity could not provide those answers at the time. The limitations of the era meant that some questions could not be answered regardless of the effort invested by detectives. The environment surrounding the investigation created additional obstacles. Because the gathering involved an illegal gambling operation, many people who may have had knowledge about the location or the individuals involved had reasons to avoid speaking openly with police. Some may have feared retaliation. Others may have worried about revealing their own connections to illegal activities. Investigators understood that silence itself had become part of the challenge. A person who knew something about the attackers might have believed that remaining quiet was safer than cooperating. This atmosphere made it extremely difficult to obtain the kind of first-hand information that often breaks major investigations. Throughout the years, detectives continued examining possible suspects and reviewing existing information. Numerous individuals were questioned, and investigators considered whether known violent offenders operating in New York during the period could have been responsible. Among those examined was Joseph Christopher, whose crimes had drawn attention during the same era. However, investigators ultimately determined that his known methods and patterns did not match the coordinated attack carried out at 116 Moore Street. Without direct evidence connecting him to the massacre, he was ruled out. This process demonstrated the careful approach investigators maintained throughout the case. They considered possibilities but required evidence before accepting conclusions. By refusing to rely on speculation, detectives protected the accuracy of the investigation, even when doing so meant leaving the case unresolved. Over time, the Palm Sunday massacre became an example of how a crime can remain both thoroughly investigated and unsolved. These two realities are not contradictory. A case can involve hundreds of interviews, extensive forensic examination, and years of investigative work while still lacking the evidence required for prosecution. The justice system requires proof beyond suspicion. Without evidence capable of connecting a specific person to the crime, an arrest cannot become a conviction. For the families of the victims, this distinction may provide little comfort. The pain of losing loved ones remains the same whether or not investigators understand the general circumstances of the crime. The absence of a trial means they never heard a complete explanation presented in court. They never saw a person held legally responsible. They were left with an investigation that established the tragedy but could not provide accountability. Decades later, the Palm Sunday massacre continues to represent both the determination and limitations of criminal investigation. Detectives have preserved the case, reviewed evidence, and continued searching for answers whenever new opportunities appeared. Yet the people responsible remain unidentified. The motive remains uncertain. The truth remains incomplete. The attack at 116 Moore Street remains a reminder that even the most devastating crimes can leave behind mysteries that survive longer than the people who investigated them. But the story of Palm Sunday is not only about the unknown killers who entered that apartment. It is also about the 8 people whose lives ended there, the 2 survivors who carried the memory of that morning forward, and the families who have waited for answers for more than 4 decades. The case remains open because those lives mattered, and because the search for truth does not end simply because time has passed. As the decades passed, the Palm Sunday massacre remained a painful reminder that some crimes leave behind more questions than answers. The attack at 116 Moore Street was not forgotten by investigators, by the community, or by the families of those who died. Although the years changed the neighborhood and the city itself evolved, the central mystery remained unchanged. The identities of the masked gunmen were still unknown. The reason they entered the apartment that morning was still uncertain. The people responsible for ending 8 lives and forever changing many others had never been held accountable. Yet the importance of the case extended beyond the search for suspects. At its heart, the Palm Sunday massacre was a story about ordinary people caught in an extraordinary moment of violence, and about the lasting consequences carried by those left behind. The victims were often remembered through the circumstances of their deaths. But before that Sunday morning, they were individuals with families, friendships, routines, and personal histories. They were men who had gathered in a familiar place among people they knew. Some may have been connected to illegal activities, including gambling or other criminal environments, but their lives cannot be reduced only to those associations. Every person inside the apartment had a story beyond the crime scene. They had relationships with parents, siblings, partners, and friends who experienced their loss not as a statistic, but as a personal tragedy. The violence inside 116 Moore Street ended those lives within minutes, but the impact of those deaths continued for decades. For the 2 survivors, the aftermath of the massacre represented a different kind of struggle. They had survived an event in which 8 others around them were killed. Their survival depended on remaining motionless while surrounded by the consequences of the attack. The decision to pretend to be dead was an instinctive act of self-preservation, but it also meant carrying memories that could never simply disappear. Their testimony became one of the most important parts of the investigation because it provided authorities with the only first-hand account of the attacker's actions inside the apartment. They confirmed that the gunmen were calm, that commands were issued before the shooting, and that the attack unfolded in a controlled and deliberate manner. However, their survival did not bring the answers investigators needed. They could describe what happened, but they could not identify who was responsible. This limitation became one of the defining tragedies of the case. The investigation established the violence, but not the identity of the people who caused it. Over the years, the Palm Sunday massacre also became a case study in the difficulties of investigating crimes connected to underground activities. Illegal gambling operations, drug networks, and criminal organizations often exist in environments where information is difficult to obtain. People involved in those worlds may distrust authorities, fear retaliation, or avoid cooperation because they do not want their own actions examined. Detectives investigating 116 Moore Street encountered exactly these challenges. They believed that someone might know more than they were willing to reveal. Someone may have understood conflicts surrounding the gambling club. Someone may have known why certain people were present that morning. Someone may have had information about the attackers before they entered the apartment. Yet knowledge and cooperation are not the same thing. A person can possess important information while still choosing silence. That silence became one of the strongest barriers in the investigation. The passage of time created additional complications. As years turned into decades, memories became more difficult to verify. Witnesses moved away, circumstances changed, and individuals connected to the original investigation aged. Details that may once have seemed insignificant could no longer be recovered. Detectives working later generations of the case had to rely heavily on preserved records, previous interviews, and physical evidence collected long before modern forensic methods became available. Cold case investigations often require patience because investigators are not simply searching for new information. They are also attempting to rediscover the significance of information that may have been overlooked years earlier. The Palm Sunday massacre represented this challenge in its most difficult form. Authorities had already established the broad outline of events. The challenge was discovering the missing connection between the evidence they possessed and the people responsible. Advances in forensic technology offered renewed hope. Throughout the United States, older cases once considered impossible to solve were reopened as investigators applied new methods to preserved evidence. These developments encouraged authorities to reconsider evidence from the Palm Sunday massacre. In 2019, officials announced that some physical evidence from the case was being reviewed using modern forensic techniques. The decision reflected the belief that time does not necessarily eliminate the possibility of justice. Scientific methods continue to develop, and evidence that once provided limited information may later reveal new details. However, despite this renewed examination, no public breakthrough emerged. The announcement created hope, but did not immediately produce the answer families had waited for. The case remained unresolved. The absence of a final resolution has shaped the way the Palm Sunday massacre is remembered. Unlike cases where a suspect is arrested and convicted, this investigation has no traditional ending. There is no courtroom testimony from an accused offender. There is no verdict explaining responsibility. There is no official account of motive beyond the theories developed by investigators. Instead, the case exists through the evidence, the memories of survivors, the reports of detectives, and the unanswered questions that remain. That uncertainty has become part of the tragedy itself. A crime involving such a large number of victims would normally be expected to produce a clear explanation. Instead, the Palm Sunday massacre remains a mystery that has survived generations. The case also highlights the importance of remembering victims separately from the mystery surrounding their deaths. Public attention often focuses on the unknown perpetrators, the investigation, and the unanswered questions. However, the true human cost of the crime lies with those who lost their lives and those who continued living with the consequences. The 8 victims were not simply names connected to an unsolved shooting. They were people whose absence affected families and communities. Remembering them means recognizing that behind every investigation file is a collection of lives interrupted. It means acknowledging that justice is not only about identifying offenders, but also about honoring those harmed by their actions. More than 40 years after the massacre, the possibility of solving the case remains uncertain, but not impossible. Law enforcement agencies continue to recognize the value of preserving evidence and maintaining records because unexpected breakthroughs can occur even after long periods of silence. A single new witness, a previously unknown connection, or a forensic discovery could potentially change the direction of the investigation. Until then, the Palm Sunday massacre remains an open wound in the history of Brooklyn. It stands as a reminder of both the destructive power of violence and the enduring need for answers. The events of April 15, 1984, began with a gathering that seemed ordinary. Friends and acquaintances came together in a familiar location, expecting nothing more dangerous than another weekend afternoon. Within minutes, that ordinary gathering became one of the deadliest unsolved shootings in New York City. The attackers left behind devastation, but they also left behind a question that has endured across decades. Who were the people who entered 116 Moore Street that morning, and why did they decide that so many lives had to end? Until those questions are answered, the Palm Sunday massacre will remain not only a case file, but a reminder of the victims whose stories deserve to be remembered and whose families continue to hope that one day the truth will finally emerge. As the Palm Sunday massacre entered the later decades of the 20th century and eventually the 21st century, the investigation became a reflection of how unresolved cases can remain alive even when years pass without a public breakthrough. Many crimes fade from public attention as new events replace older tragedies. But the scale and brutality of what happened at 116 Moore Street ensured that the case continued to be remembered. 8 people had been killed inside a residential apartment in the middle of Brooklyn during a Sunday morning gathering. 2 others survived injuries that could have easily been fatal. The attackers had entered, carried out the killings, and disappeared without leaving behind a confirmed identity. The combination of a large number of victims, the deliberate nature of the attack, and the mystery surrounding the motive ensured that the Palm Sunday massacre remained one of New York City's most haunting unsolved cases. In the years following the massacre, investigators continued to evaluate whether the original theories still represented the most likely explanations. The possibility of organized criminal involvement remained central because of the environment surrounding the apartment. The location was not simply a private gathering place. It was an illegal gambling operation where money was regularly exchanged and where some individuals present reportedly had connections to criminal activity. Detectives understood that disputes within such environments could become extremely dangerous. A disagreement involving money, loyalty, or territory could potentially result in violence carried out as punishment or retaliation. However, investigators also understood the importance of separating what was possible from what could be proven. The existence of criminal connections among some victims did not automatically establish that a criminal organization was responsible. The evidence had to show who planned the attack, who carried it out, and why. Those answers never emerged. The possibility that the massacre was a personal revenge attack also remained unresolved. Investigators considered whether the gunman may have entered the apartment with the intention of killing a particular person or a small number of individuals. If that was the case, the remaining victims may have been murdered because they were witnesses who could identify the attackers. The method of the attack supported this possibility because the gunman appeared focused on eliminating everyone who could potentially provide information. Yet again, the theory faced a major obstacle. Investigators never identified the person or people who may have been the intended targets. Without that information, the motive remained uncertain. The investigation therefore continued to exist between several possible explanations, none supported by enough evidence to become a confirmed conclusion. The case also demonstrated the limitations of relying on witness testimony alone. The 2 survivors provided investigators with critical information about the sequence of events. Their accounts confirmed that the attackers were masked, armed, and deliberate in their actions. They established that the victims were ordered to the floor before the shooting began. They confirmed that the gunmen were not acting in panic or confusion, but appeared controlled and purposeful. However, their circumstances prevented them from providing the one detail investigators needed most: identification. They could not see the attackers' faces. They could not provide names. They could not offer descriptions detailed enough to distinguish the suspects from others. Their testimony explained a crime, but could not solve it. This was not unusual in cases involving sudden acts of extreme violence. Survivors are often asked to provide information during moments when their primary concern is survival. Fear, shock, injuries, and rapidly changing circumstances can make accurate identification nearly impossible. In the Palm Sunday massacre, the survivors' actions saved their lives. But the same circumstances that allowed them to survive also limited what they could later tell investigators. As time passed, law enforcement continued examining whether anyone who had remained silent might eventually decide to cooperate. Investigators understood that cases involving organized crime or illegal activities often depend on individuals who may initially refuse to speak. Fear can be powerful, especially when people believe that providing information could put themselves or their families at risk. The silence surrounding the Palm Sunday massacre became one of its defining characteristics. Detectives believed there were individuals who knew more than they revealed, but suspicion alone could not create a prosecution. Without a witness willing to provide direct information or physical evidence connecting suspects to the crime, investigators remained unable to move forward. The challenge was not simply discovering possible suspects. It was finding evidence strong enough to prove their involvement beyond a reasonable doubt. During later reviews of the case, investigators also examined the role of physical evidence, and whether advancements in forensic science could provide new opportunities. In 1984, criminal investigations relied on methods that were far more limited than those available today. Evidence collected at the scene could establish important facts about the attack, but the ability to identify individuals through biological material or advanced analysis was still developing. Decades later, forensic technology had changed dramatically. Cold case investigators across the country demonstrated that old evidence could sometimes provide new answers when examined through modern techniques. The Palm Sunday Massacre was part of this broader movement toward re-examining historical cases. The 2019 review of physical evidence reflected the continued effort to determine whether modern methods could uncover information unavailable during the original investigation. However, despite renewed examination, no suspect was publicly identified and no charges followed. The lack of resolution did not diminish the importance of the investigation. Instead, it highlighted the reality that even improved technology has limitations. Science can reveal information contained within evidence, but it cannot recover evidence that was never preserved or provide certainty where crucial connections are missing. A forensic discovery may identify a person, but it cannot always explain motive or prove the full circumstances surrounding a crime. The Palm Sunday Massacre remained difficult because the investigation lacked not only a suspect but also a clear path connecting the evidence to a specific individual. The continued mystery surrounding the case also affected how the tragedy was remembered within the broader history of New York City crime. The 1980s were a period when many communities faced concerns about violence, drugs, and organized criminal activity. The massacre became one of the most extreme examples of that era's dangers. Yet the case was different from many other violent crimes because it did not end with an arrest or conviction. Instead, it remained an unanswered question, representing the fear and uncertainty experienced by communities where violence could occur suddenly and without warning. For those who lost family members, however, the case was never simply a historical event. It remained a personal loss. Each victim represented a life that ended unexpectedly. Each family experienced the consequences of a crime that provided no official explanation or legal conclusion. The absence of a trial meant there was no moment when responsibility was publicly assigned, no opportunity to hear a complete account of what happened from the person accused of causing it. The families were left with memories of their loved ones and the unanswered questions that accompanied their deaths. The enduring significance of the Palm Sunday Massacre lies not only in the mystery of the perpetrators but also in what the case reveals about the pursuit of justice. Investigators worked for years to understand the crime. They examined evidence, questioned witnesses, and followed possible leads. They established a detailed understanding of what occurred inside the apartment. Even though they could not identify those responsible, the investigation showed both the strengths and limitations of law enforcement efforts. Dedication alone cannot always overcome missing evidence, fearful witnesses, or the passage of time. Yet the continued existence of the case file demonstrates that unresolved does not mean forgotten. More than 4 decades after the gunman entered 116 Moore Street, the Palm Sunday Massacre remains an open chapter in New York City's history. The victims remain remembered, the investigation remains preserved, and the possibility of future answers remains alive. The case continues to ask the same questions that investigators confronted in 1984. Who planned this attack? Who carried it out? What reason could justify such violence? Until those questions are finally answered, the Palm Sunday Massacre will remain a symbol of both tragedy and perseverance, a reminder that some searches for truth continue long after the headlines disappear. As the investigation into the Palm Sunday Massacre entered its final decades, the case became less defined by active police searches and more by the enduring effort to preserve the possibility of justice. The passage of time had changed many things. The neighborhood surrounding 116 Moore Street had evolved. The detectives who first responded to the crime scene had moved on through retirements and new assignments. The witnesses and survivors had grown older. Yet the central questions remained exactly the same as they had been on the morning of April 15th, 1984. Who were the masked men who entered the apartment? Who gave the order for such a devastating attack? What motive could have led someone to deliberately kill 8 people and leave 2 others seriously wounded? More than 40 years later, those questions continue to define the mystery of the Palm Sunday massacre. One of the most difficult aspects of the case is that investigators have always possessed a relatively clear understanding of what happened inside the apartment, but very little certainty about what happened before or after the attack. The sequence of violence was reconstructed through physical evidence and survivor testimony. The gunman entered the second-floor apartment, controlled the people inside, forced them to the floor, and carried out a systematic shooting. The attackers were not described as confused or frightened. They appeared organized and deliberate. They did not waste time searching for valuables. They did not engage in a random exchange of gunfire. Their actions suggested that they arrived with a specific purpose and left once that purpose had been completed. Yet understanding the actions of the killers inside the apartment did not reveal the identities of the people responsible. The investigation remained trapped between certainty and uncertainty. Detectives knew the nature of the crime, but not the names behind it. They knew the method, but not the motive. They knew the victims, but could not determine exactly why those individuals had been chosen. This gap between knowing what happened and knowing why it happened became the defining challenge of the case. Over the years, investigators continued examining whether new information could change their understanding of the crime. Cold cases often depend on unexpected developments. A witness who decides to speak after years of silence, a confession, a connection between previously unrelated evidence, or advances in forensic science that reveal information hidden for decades. The Palm Sunday massacre remained open because authorities understood that such possibilities existed. A case may appear frozen, but investigations can change when circumstances change. The passage of time can sometimes weaken a case, but it can also create opportunities that were impossible during the original investigation. One of those opportunities came through advances in forensic technology. When the massacre occurred in 1984, investigators worked with tools that were far more limited than those available today. Modern DNA testing, improved evidence analysis, and digital investigative methods have transformed how law enforcement approaches older crimes. Evidence that once seemed unable to provide answers can sometimes become valuable years later. Recognizing this possibility, authorities revisited evidence connected to the Palm Sunday massacre. In 2019, officials confirmed that certain physical evidence from the case was being examined again using newer forensic techniques. The decision reflected a continuing belief that the investigation deserved renewed attention. However, the review did not publicly produce an identified suspect or a major breakthrough. The case remained unresolved. The absence of a breakthrough after renewed examination demonstrated another difficult reality of cold case investigations. Technology can provide new opportunities, but it cannot guarantee answers. Modern methods are powerful, but they depend on the quality and availability of evidence. They cannot always overcome the challenges created by time, missing information, or the absence of a direct connection between evidence and a specific person. In the Palm Sunday massacre, the attackers had already taken steps to conceal their identities. The survivors could not provide detailed descriptions. The physical evidence confirmed the violence, but did not publicly reveal who committed it. The investigation, therefore, remained dependent on the possibility that new information would emerge from outside sources. Another enduring question involved the role of the wider community. Investigators believe that someone may have possessed information about the attack, the motive, or the people responsible. In crimes connected to illegal activities, information often exists within small circles. People may know what happened, but refuse to share it. Fear, loyalty, distrust, or personal involvement can all prevent cooperation. The Palm Sunday massacre reflected this challenge. The apartment was not an isolated location unknown to the community. It was a place where people gathered regularly. The attack occurred in an environment where relationships and connections existed. Yet those connections did not produce the testimony necessary to solve the crime. The silence surrounding the case became almost as significant as the evidence collected at the scene. For law enforcement, silence creates a unique obstacle because it cannot be analyzed in the same way as physical evidence. Investigators can examine fingerprints, shell casings, and documents. They can compare statements and follow financial records. But they cannot easily measure what someone chooses not to say. They can suspect that information exists, but suspicion cannot replace proof. This reality explains why the investigation continued without arrest despite years of effort. The legal system requires evidence that can withstand scrutiny in court, not simply theories that appear reasonable. The Palm Sunday massacre also serves as a reminder of the importance of victim stories. In many notorious crimes, public attention naturally focuses on the unknown offender. The mystery surrounding the attacker becomes the center of discussion. However, the true human impact of the case belongs to the people whose lives were taken and those who survived. The 8 victims were individuals with families and personal histories. They were not merely names connected to a crime scene. Their deaths created losses that continued long after the investigation slowed. The 2 survivors experienced a different form of lasting impact. They carried the memory of a moment when ordinary life changed instantly into unimaginable violence. Their testimony helped preserve the truth of what happened, ensuring that the massacre would not become only a collection of unanswered questions. Because of them, investigators and the public understand the basic events of that morning. Their survival provided a connection between the past and the present. As the years continue to pass, the Palm Sunday massacre remains a case defined by both tragedy and determination. The absence of an arrest has never changed the seriousness of the crime or the commitment to finding answers. Investigators continue to recognize the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining records, because future developments may create opportunities that do not currently exist. A single new piece of information could alter the direction of the investigation. A witness who once remained silent could decide to speak. A new forensic method could uncover a connection previously impossible to identify. The possibility remains, even after decades of uncertainty. Ultimately, the story of the Palm Sunday massacre is not only about an unsolved crime. It is about the consequences of violence and the long-lasting search for truth. It is about the families who lost loved ones, the survivors who carried painful memories, and the investigators who continued searching despite countless obstacles. The attackers may have disappeared, but the case has never disappeared completely. The events of April 15, 1984, remain preserved in history as one of Brooklyn's darkest moments, a tragedy that continues to demand answers. Until the day those responsible are identified, the Palm Sunday massacre will remain an unfinished story, one defined by loss, unanswered questions, and the enduring hope that the truth may eventually come to light. The Palm Sunday massacre remains one of those rare criminal cases where the passage of time has failed to provide the answers that investigators, survivors, and families have sought for generations. More than 4 decades after the violence at 116 Moore Street, the case continues to exist between 2 realities. On one side are the facts that have been firmly established. On April 15, 1984, a group of armed men entered a second-floor apartment in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, ordered those inside to the ground, and carried out a carefully executed attack that left 8 people dead and 2 others wounded. On the other side are the questions that remain unanswered. Who were those men? Why did they commit such a brutal act? And how were they able to disappear without ever being identified? The lack of resolution has made the Palm Sunday massacre not only a tragic event in New York City history, but also a lasting example of the difficulties involved in solving crimes where fear, silence, and limited evidence combine to prevent justice. From the beginning, investigators understood that they were not dealing with a random act of violence. The circumstances surrounding the attack pointed toward planning and intention. The gunmen did not enter the apartment in confusion or panic. They did not appear interested in stealing money or valuables. Their actions suggested that they arrived with a specific objective and carried it out with a level of control that shocked investigators. The victims were not caught in an unpredictable exchange of gunfire. They were placed in a vulnerable position and deliberately targeted. This distinction shaped the entire investigation because it indicated that the answer likely depended on understanding the relationships, conflicts, and circumstances surrounding the people gathered inside the apartment that morning. The apartment at 116 Moore Street represented an important part of that investigation. To outsiders, it appeared to be an ordinary residence in Brooklyn. But inside, it functioned as a gathering place where people came together regularly to play cards, gamble, drink, and socialize. The illegal gambling operation became one of the most important factors considered by investigators. It provided a possible explanation for why someone might organize such a violent attack. Money, debts, disputes, and criminal relationships can create dangerous conflicts. However, the existence of those possibilities did not provide a complete answer. Investigators needed evidence showing exactly who had a motive and who had the ability to carry out the attack. That evidence never became available. One of the greatest mysteries surrounding the massacre remains the identity of the intended victims. The attackers killed everyone they could inside the apartment, leaving investigators to consider multiple possibilities. Perhaps the entire gathering was targeted because of its connection to illegal gambling. Perhaps one or two individuals were the primary targets and the others were killed to prevent witnesses from surviving. Perhaps the motive involved a personal dispute that investigators never uncovered. Each explanation carried some possibility, but none could be proven. Without knowing who the killers wanted to eliminate and why, detectives could not identify the chain of events that led to the attack. The two survivors provided the foundation for understanding what happened during those terrible minutes. Their accounts confirmed the presence of at least two armed men, possibly with another person assisting outside. They described the attackers' commands and the way the shooting unfolded. Their survival was extraordinary, but their ability to provide information was limited by the circumstances they faced. The gunmen had concealed their identities. The victims were forced to look away or remain on the ground. The attack happened quickly, leaving little opportunity for observation. The survivors gave investigators the most accurate picture possible, but they could not provide the identification that might have changed the course of the case. Their testimony became both a critical source of information and a painful reminder of the limitations faced by witnesses to sudden violence. The investigation continued for years because detectives believed the truth was still somewhere within the available evidence. Hundreds of people were questioned, backgrounds were examined, possible connections to criminal organizations were explored, individuals connected to the gambling operation and the victims were investigated. Authorities considered various suspects and theories, including possible links to other violent offenders active in New York during the same period. Yet every possible direction eventually faced the same barrier: insufficient evidence. A theory could explain what might have happened, but it could not prove who was responsible. The investigation of Joseph Christopher demonstrated this careful approach. Although his activities in New York during the same era brought him to investigators' attention, authorities found important differences between his known crimes and the Palm Sunday massacre. His methods and patterns did not match the coordinated attack at 116 Moore Street. Without evidence connecting him directly to the massacre, investigators eliminated him as a suspect. This decision reflected the broader challenge of the case. Investigators had to consider possibilities without allowing speculation to replace proof. As decades passed, the role of forensic science became increasingly important. The original investigation took place during a period when many modern forensic tools were unavailable. The evidence collected in 1984 could establish important details about the crime, but could not provide the level of identification possible today. As technology advanced, investigators gained new opportunities to revisit older cases. The Palm Sunday Massacre was among those investigations where preserved evidence offered the possibility of new information. The review of physical evidence announced in 2019 demonstrated that authorities had not abandoned the search for answers. However, despite renewed examination, no public breakthrough followed. The case remained open but unsolved. The continuing mystery has also affected the way the Palm Sunday Massacre is remembered. Public discussions about the case often focus on the unknown gunman and the unanswered questions surrounding their motive. But the most important part of the story remains the victims themselves. 8 people lost their lives in a matter of minutes. Their families experienced sudden loss without the explanation that often comes after a criminal conviction. They never saw a courtroom reveal the full circumstances of what happened. They never heard a judge announce responsibility. Instead, they lived with uncertainty that continued year after year. The tragedy of the Palm Sunday Massacre is therefore not only that a terrible crime occurred, but also that those affected by it never received complete answers. The survivors and families represent the human side of an investigation that might otherwise become only a historical case file. Their experiences remind us that behind every unsolved crime are real people whose lives continue beyond the headlines. The victims were not defined by the circumstances of their deaths. They were people with connections, memories, and futures that ended unexpectedly. Remembering them is an essential part of understanding why the search for answers matters. Today, the Palm Sunday Massacre remains a symbol of both the persistence and limitations of criminal investigation. It demonstrates that law enforcement agencies can dedicate enormous effort to a case and still encounter obstacles that cannot easily be overcome. Fear can silence witnesses. Time can erase memories. Evidence can be incomplete. Technology can provide new opportunities but cannot guarantee solutions. Yet the continued attention given to the case proves that unresolved does not mean forgotten. The investigation remains part of New York City's history because the victims' lives mattered and because the pursuit of truth continues. The morning of April 15, 1984, began as an ordinary gathering in a Brooklyn apartment. It ended as one of the city's most devastating acts of violence. The people responsible walked away and remained unidentified. The families left behind continued waiting. The survivors carried memories that could never be erased. And investigators continued searching for answers that have remained hidden for more than 40 years. The Palm Sunday Massacre remains an unfinished chapter, but it is a chapter that continues to be written through remembrance, investigation, and the hope that one day the truth will finally be known.